Hi everyone, welcome back to a PowerShell tutorial section, and this time we're going to be talking about PowerShell loops. We're going to talk about the for loop, the while loop, the do while loop, the for each loop, and we're also going to talk about the do until loop. And we're going to run through each of these with examples to show you how looping works in PowerShell. So let's get straight into it. So here on my PowerShell environment, I have Visual Studio Code set up, and I'm going to start typing out some of these loops. The first loop we're going to go and check out is the for each loop. This is one of the more basic loops that we actually use in PowerShell. So we're going to call this array fruit. It would help if I could type. And we're going to add some elements to this array. Let's add apple, pear, and let's add berry to this array here. So what I want to do is I want to iterate over this array, and I want to process each of these things, the apple, the pear, and the berry. Now each of these elements is going to have a different position. We can check this out by running this code and loading this variable into my shell. I can now access this by doing $fruit, and I can do fruit 0. And if I do fruit 0, I get apple because that is the position of apple. If I do fruit 1, I will get pear, and if I do fruit 2, I will actually get berry. What I can also do is if I clear this off, I can also talk to multiple. So if I do 0, 1, I will get back apple and pear. If I do 0, 2, that will give me back all of them because the dots will extrapolate to 0, 1, and 2. Now I want to iterate over each of these items. So to do so, I'm not going to call this fruit anymore. I'm going to call this fruits with an S. This is going to help us when doing one of these loops later on to identify different components of the loop. So we're going to do for each here. So when I do a for each loop, what I need to do is I need to tell it what I want to iterate over. So in this case, I want to iterate over fruits, but I want to iterate over each individual item in fruits. So we've got fruits as a collection, so fruit would be a single fruit in this instance. So if I do $fruit at this point, and I do for each fruit in $fruits. Now, this doesn't need to be fruit and fruits. This could be anything you want it to be. It just makes sense to use singular and plural in this instance. Make things a little easier for us to work with. Now notice I've also got here normal brackets. These need to be normal brackets or parentheticals if you want to be posh, to specify what section I want to loop over. And then I'm going to use some curlies after this. Now I could set these curlies up on a new line if I want to, or I could choose to set them up like that. Might look a little bit nicer for us to work with to see that this loop is actually self-contained. So anything in between curlies, so anything in between these two curlies is known as a script block. And this is the section that we're going to loop over with this for each loop. Now, what's interesting about this is this fruits element here is related to this fruits array. Now, as we loop over this, this loop is going to complete for the amount of times that I have instances, or the amount of times I have for things in this array. So in this case, I'm going to end up looping 1, 2, 3 times here. Apple, pear, and berry. And each time this completes a loop, what it's going to do is it's going to change the contents of this $fruit variable. This $fruit variable is accessible only inside this script block here. At the first loop, that $fruit variable is going to be apple. The second loop, it's going to be pear, and the third loop, it's going to be berry. So if we use something very simple in here, like for example a write-host command, and within that write-host command we're going to say I want you to write the output of $fruit. But let's make that a little bit more interesting. Let's just add some extra text on there. Let's say the fruit is, and then we'll close that text off. Now you'll see a nice coloring here. This is actually just string information, so the fruit is just going to be text, whereas $fruit is going to be extrapolated into the contents of $fruit at that point. So what I should expect to see is the fruit is apple, the fruit is pear, and the fruit is berry. Let's go and run that in here, and we should find that we have the output. Let's go and execute that code by hitting F5. The output is the fruit is apple, the fruit is pear, and the fruit is berry. Very nice. Okay, so that's a very simple for each loop. Okay, let's extrapolate that out a little bit further. So let's go from a for each loop, and let's go into create a new text file here. Actually, let's comment out that for each loop now. So we'll use some large comment blocks here, just like we can in PowerShell. Wonderful. And let's move on to our next loop that we actually want to go and create. Let's go extrapolate out a more traditional for loop that you may see in other programming languages as well. So let's take a very standard for, FOR, and we're going to actually have again these two parentheticals defining on how this for loop is going to work. But now instead of two elements in here, the single fruit and the fruits, what we're actually going to do is we're going to have three elements in here. So we're going to use $I. So we're going to use $I. We're going to set $I to 0. We're going to then do $I is less than 10. And then we're going to do another comma, and we're going to do $I. In fact, no, sorry. Incorrect there. We're not using commas, we're using semicolons, otherwise this isn't going to work. $I plus plus. And then we're going to have a code block on the end of this. And we're going to actually do another right host. The number is $I. So in this sense, what's actually happening with this loop? Well, there's three elements within this for section. This first element is creating a variable called $I is equal to 0. Now, it doesn't have to be $I. It could actually be anything that we're actually setting up here. We could call this $potato. It doesn't matter. In this sense, $I is just abbreviation for integer. You'll see this in many other programming languages as well. So $I was setting up this initial counter at 0. And what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate. We're going to evaluate, is $I LT or less than 10? If $I is less than 10, what I want to do is I want to run that loop. And then we get to the end of the loop. When we get to the end of this little script block of the loop, what it's going to do, it's going to run this final section here. Now this is I++. The plus means iterate I by 1. So now in this case, what's happened is I is equal to 0. Is I less than 10? Yes, it is less than 10. So we can run the script block. After we run the script block, at the end of it, we're going to iterate I by 1. I is now no longer 0. I is now 1. But we go back through the process. We evaluate again. We say, okay, is I still less than 10? Yes, because I is now currently set to 1. So we run that loop again. We iterate once more. I is now 2. Is that less than 10? Yes, it is. It's still less than 10. Therefore, we run the loop again, and we do that over and over and over again until, in this case, I is less than 10. If it's over 10, that returns false and the loop stops. So if we go and run this, we will now see the output as the number is 0 all the way through to the number is 9, because as soon as I gets to 10, it is no longer less than 10, it is equal to 10. So therefore that will return false and the loop will break. So it's a very simple for loop here. Now we could change that around in many different ways. We don't have to use less thans, we could use greater thans, we could use equals, it doesn't matter. We don't necessarily have to even use integers either. This for loop can be extrapolated out in many different ways. We just have to set up the initial counter, actually do some evaluation on that to see whether it returns true or false, and then finally decide what we need to do at the end of every loop. So let's continue on. What we can also do with these is things like, for example, a while loop. So let's go and extrapolate this again. Let's comment all that out. And let's have another loop down here. Let's have a while loop. So within a while loop, we might set up $I again if we want to. So we could say $I is equal to 0, and now we can use the while command. So we can say $I is 0 while I is less than 10. So it's going to produce the same output as we saw before, but what we need to do is iterate things slightly differently. So we're setting up I is equal to 0 at the moment, I is less than 10. Let's do a write-host, and let's do the number is ... and let's do $I again. What we still need to do is we still need to increase I. So we'll go for $I plus plus at the end of this. So at the end of that loop, we know that that's going to add 1 to I, and it's going to increase it up to that upper limit of 10. If we run that code again, we can see we get exactly the same results, 0 through to 9, a way of achieving the same thing in a couple of different ways in PowerShell. But fundamentally, those while loops might be, for example, individual lists. So another example of that while loop might be, for example, while I is less than 10, maybe it's just a list of fruits, and we could go through for berry, pear, apple, and go while fruit is not equal to this. We could then go and set up a loop to run, and as soon as it becomes that, we can set the loop to actually break. So let's go have a look with a do while loop, another way of kind of accomplishing this task. Again, let's just go and comment out some of this information so we can use a different loop but on the same essentially piece of paper here. And let's do $I is now equal to 0. Again, that's great, and we'll use a do rather than a while loop. So inside this do loop, again, we're going to have a script block, and we're going to do a write host, and we're going to write $I out again for me. That's great. And we're going to write $I. In fact, we're going to add some text, writing out the number of I. So writing out the number of I. And then what we're going to do is we're going to iterate back over I there and just say I plus plus. And we're going to do that while I is less than 10. And again, let's go run that operation. Within that loop, we still have the same output, 0 through to 9, but we're iterating over things in a different way and evaluating things in a slightly different way here. So we're going to do while loop. We also have an ability to change that from a do while loop to a do until loop if we really want to as well. So if we change that from a do while to a do until loop, we get a slightly different output here. We actually get a writing of the number out of 0 because it's do until I is less than 10. That's going to immediately expire because in that first loop, I is equal to 0, which means it is less than 10. Therefore, the only output I'm getting is writing out the number of 0. If we change that around to not less than 10, but maybe equal to 10, we're going to get a slightly different result here. Write that out, and then I get that same sort of result, 0 through to 9. Because now, each time I is being iterated from 1 all the way up through to 9, or from 0, sorry, all the way up through to 9, we can see until it reaches 10, that loop will continue to run. So we could also pass this for many different things as well. So maybe if we just comment this piece out as well, let's extrapolate this. Let's extrapolate this to another command. So for example, I need to run something like get-process. Okay, and if I run get-process, I'm actually going to get a result out of this. I'm going to get a number of processes that are running on my computer. There's quite a few here. Now, of these number of processes, what I could do is I could iterate over each of these processes in a different way. I could pass that output to one of these foreach commands. But if I use foreach-object in here, this will process through each individual command down here. So for each object, I'm going to put a nice little script block down here, and I'm going to do a little if statement in here. So if I do if, let's scroll that up a little bit. If you remember back over to the if components that we talked about in a previous video, we'll go and have a look if $_ dot process name, which is going to be related to this process name here. Now each one of these individual objects is going to have a process name, like for example process name AI, process name audio DG, process name background task host, and so on and so forth. What we can say is if process name matches a certain condition, so if process name dash EQ, let's go for code, for VS Code, run this block. I have, let's write dash host. I have found VS Code running. And we can go and run this block now. And what it's going to do is it will process through every single process that's running on my computer and then evaluate it to see if its name is equal to code. If it is, it will run that block. I have found VS Code running. And you can see I technically have multiple copies of VS Code running because it's running multiple sessions actually in the background of this machine. So it's found VS Code running many times. So one final little thing I want to show you. Sometimes you want to be quick and dirty with one of these commands. Like for example, let's bring up just a very basic PowerShell terminal here. Now, what about if I wanted to access a certain website? So let's go and say something like let's do invoke-web request, okay, to go and grab a website. If you're from the Linux land, this is a little bit like curl. And let's do URI, and let's go and just grab https://news.bbc.co.uk. Okay, and let's go run that. That's going to grab that BBC news.bbc.co.uk web page and pull it down into my shell here. So we can see the output is actually quite long. Maybe I want to go and grab just a little bit of information out of here. Maybe I want to go and grab, for example, a status code. Okay, so let's go and grab this, and let's just pop that into some curlies over here, like so, and just do status code. Okay, so that's going to run. It's going to return that status code of 200 or HTTP 200. Okay, now maybe what I want to do is I want to go and grab that web page multiple times, and when I grab that multiple times, we might be using this for testing load balancers and things like that. So I could do a little for each loop, or I could do something really quick and dirty. If I come back here into my shell, in fact, let's delete that. If I type the number 1, I get 1. If I type the number 2, I get 2. If I type the number 5, I get 5. Okay, that's not impressive. If you do 1.5, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ah, those 2 dots are filling everything in. So we can use this as part of one of our loops. So if I wanted to do something really dirty to this, or really quick to this, what I can do is I can actually pass those into a loop. So watch this. 1.5 pipe, and send that to a percentage command. Now, in a lot of other programming languages, the percentage command is a modulus. Here in PowerShell, this percentage command is actually going to be a for each loop. It's an abbreviation for a for each loop. So for each, I could put a couple of curlies around here, and then maybe, for example, I do something like this. Write-host count. Look, I get count 5 times. So what does that mean? Well, I could take something like this previous command, this invoke web request status code, 1.10 pipe for each curly bracket, close the curly bracket the other side, and that is now going to attempt to run this as fast as possible. Okay, ticking over up to 10. Another neat little trick is you might want to rate limit this because sometimes when it's trying to execute as fast as possible, it's a little too quick. So one of the things you can do is just drop that down one and type in sleep 1. If you're wondering how I dropped that down one, I was holding shift with my little finger here, same thing you use to sip your cup of tea, and hit enter at the same time, and that's going to drop me onto a new line. Now with sleep 1, that's just going to put a 1-second delay in between actually firing off that invoke web request. So a very quick and easy way of actually doing a for each loop. It's not perfect. I wouldn't recommend really using that in code. Kind of stick with these sort of methods in code, or if you look at these full loops arrays here, these sort of more fully extrapolated methods. I don't like to use things like a lot of abbreviations in PowerShell code. It makes it less readable. But sometimes when you're just bashing things at the shell and you need to get things done as fast as possible, you can use a lot of abbreviations like that abbreviation here for percentage, which normally would look like modulus, but in this case in PowerShell is actually a for each loop. So I hope you enjoyed this section on loops within PowerShell, and we've gone over some of the major loop types in PowerShell quite quickly. Have a play with these, extrapolate them yourself, throw lists of information at them, throw arrays of information, get commands, do some get service, do some get process, fire things at the internet with invoke-web request, and have a go with it. All of these kind of looping concepts roll over into most other programming and scripting languages you may use on the internet today, like JavaScript and Python and Golang and Rust and all the others that you've got out there as well. I hope you join me next time for more PowerShell content and more Azure content. And you know the routine, hashtag like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me next time. Goodbye.